which many took as a hint that in the end, the monarch's natural benevolence would put him on the Third Estate's side. By mid-December, Necker knew that crucial decisions could not be put off much longer. Quite apart from the clamor of public debate and pamphleteering in Paris, there was growing confusion in the provinces over the issue of provincial estates. On this, the minister obviously had no coherent policy. It was generally expected that estates like those of Dauphiné would soon be established where they did not exist. And there was a widespread assumption that deputies to the Estates General would be chosen by them. Consequently, the form of provincial estates was of particular importance, but few nobles, even if they accepted doubling the third, seemed prepared to abandon vote by order, and where estates already existed, they showed no desire to give up traditional forms of procedures. How could the third be effectively doubled in Brittany, where every nobleman enjoyed a right to sit in person, and they regularly turned up in their hundreds? Any practical reform was bound to deprive most noblemen of their time-honored political rights. Non-noble Bretons had in fact been complaining for years about underrepresentation in the provincial estates, and they now saw that if the Vizille principles were to be adopted in other provinces, their position would become even more glaringly anomalous. So when a meeting of the Breton estates was announced for January, a town meeting in Rennes demanded that it should abolish all tax privileges in the province and widen Third Estate representation. Prosperous commercial Nantes went even further. On 4th November, it called for limitation of noble and clerical numbers and demanded that the first two orders agree to these changes in advance or face a strike by Third Estate deputies. Meanwhile, meetings of other provincial estates were being authorized, and only in Dauphiné, where the pattern elaborated at Romans in September was followed. Was there no serious dissension? Elsewhere, those with privileged representation showed themselves determined to maintain it, even against fellow members of their own orders, in Provence, Artois, and Franche-Comté, only certain types of noble had traditionally participated. But they adamantly refused to admit others, even for the purpose of electing deputies to the Estates General. At the same time, they spurned third estate claims to increased representation and open election of members. Inevitably, the disappointed groups deluged the government with petitions. These were the circumstances in which the first great decision about the Estates General was taken. Necker spent the whole of the week before Christmas with the king, and on 27 December, in a document entitled Result of the King's Council of State, he finally pronounced on the central questions in public debate since September. The third estate in the Estates General was to be doubled. The advice of the notables was therefore rejected, and the public pressure built up over the autumn had triumphed. The notables had also opposed allowing deputies to be elected for and by orders other than their own. This too Necker ignored, to the alarm of some third estate supporters who feared that highly placed noble or clerical candidates might be elected by over-deferential commoners. But in one thing he followed the notables. He did not concede vote by head. He expressed the hope that, once the estates had met, they would agree to deliberate and vote in common. But it must be by their own free choice. In this way, Necker attempted to avoid alienating the first two orders while retaining the goodwill of the third. And so the popularity he craved so much remained unimpaired. But the price of this achievement was to leave a fundamental issue unresolved. Every elector casting his vote in the subsequent spring was aware that those he was helping to choose would need to confront it before they considered anything else. The result of the council marked the end of the first phase in the electoral campaign. It had witnessed a transformation in the political atmosphere, whose speed and scale astonished everyone. Since September, public opinion had completely repolarized. The political consensus against despotism, which had exulted in the downfall of Brienne and Lamoignon, and brought Necker to new peaks of public idolatry, still existed. But constitutional questions had now been pushed into the background by social ones, and on them the consensus had broken down. The bourgeoisie, hitherto mere spectators in public life, had suddenly realized that they were being offered a permanent role in it, and that by their own efforts they might make it a dominant role. But In the process, all their latent resentments and antagonisms towards what were now always described as the privileged orders were aroused and inflamed. Not all those involved in this campaign were members of the Third Estate. Most of Duport's society certainly were not, but in their own orders, such people remained a minority. And the ferocity of the anti-noble and anti-clerical sentiments soon being widely expressed ensured that they made few further converts. Instead, alarmed nobles and clerics sought protection in the very precedents and privileges that educated commoners were now finding so obnoxious. Bourgeois' fury at their intransigence then redoubled. It found its most eloquent expression in January 1789 in C.S. pamphlet, What is the Third Estate?, which argued that there was no place in a properly constituted nation for privileged groups of any sort. The Third Estate, which had hitherto counted for nothing in the political order, was in fact everything for a nation. C.S. declared was a body of associates living under a common law, and privileges by definition were exceptions to common law. The nobility were a caste of idle, burdensome usurpers, and there should be no question of allowing them to be chosen as Third Estate deputies. C.S. refused completely to believe in the good faith of nobles who had renounced fiscal privileges, pointing to a whole range of others they had not offered up. He suggested that the Third Estate deputies, once elected, should set themselves up without further ado as a national assembly and have no dealings with the other two orders. By now, indeed, it was a commonplace for the Third Estate cause to be called national and patriotism, which ever since the crisis of 1771 had meant opposition to despotic government, was increasingly taken over as a label for Third Estate aspirations. What is the Third Estate was only the most eloquent among hundreds of no less vehement pamphlets denouncing the privileged orders appearing over the winter, and events in certain provinces seemed to bear out all the worst predictions. In Brittany, the news of the result of the council became known as the Third Estate deputies were arriving for the estates. They promptly agreed to transact no business until reform of the estates was accepted by the other two orders. The nobility, who had flocked in unprecedented numbers for such an important meeting refused all compromise. And on 3rd January, a royal order suspended proceedings for a month to allow tempers to cool. The nobility, enraged, continued to deliberate in the teeth of bitter and increasingly violent denunciations from most of the province's major towns. When the aristocratic parliament of Rennes forbade illicit municipal assemblies, it was ignored. And some of its staunchest traditional supporters, the city's law students, forsook it to join in the popular demands for reform of the estates. In an ill-judged attempt to exploit popular animosity towards the well-heeled bourgeois who led the reform movement, certain nobles set their chairmen, servants, and other dependents to organizing demonstrations against reform. On 26 January, a vast crowd was assembled in the city center, calling for the maintenance of the Breton Constitution and a lowering of the price of bread. It was attacked by bands of patriotic students, and several days of fighting culminated in the nobility being besieged in their meeting hall. In the end, they fought their way out, sword in hand, and several people were killed. By the beginning of February, the tumults had subsided somewhat. But the estates had achieved nothing. All hope of reconciliation between nobles and Third Estate in Brittany had gone, and the whole country had witnessed nobles prepared to fight rather than abandon their privileges. These months also witnessed the emergence of Third Estate leaders. Before November 1788, there had hardly been any. Only the names of the foremost Grenoble patriots, Mounier and Barnave, were widely known. And the campaign for doubling the third and vote by head had to be launched and orchestrated by the metropolitan aristocrats of Duport's society. But once launched, it was soon beyond the society's control, and commoners began to speak for themselves. They wrote pamphlets. Volney's periodical, The People's Sentinel, did much to articulate and focus bourgeois grievances in Brittany. In the South, the burden of generations of civil disabilities inspired the pen of the Protestant pastor Ribaut de Saint-Étienne, while Robespierre's first foray into politics was his appeal to the artisan nation to abandon the archaic and privilege-ridden structure of the provincial estates of Artois. They organized town meetings and drafted petitions to local, provincial, and central authorities, In Brittany, the patriots of Nantes and other cities marshaled bands of volunteers to go to Rennes to fight the iron swords. And setting the pace of this activity, almost everywhere were lawyers. Everything would have been calm in Franche-Comté, a bitter Besançon nobleman confided to his diary, if 10 advocates had been hanged. Ever since the end of the First Assembly of Notables, the constitutional crisis had revolved around an attempt to browbeat the courts, raising issues to which no lawyer could remain indifferent. And once the Estates General were won, the problem of their composition was a lawyer's paradise. Besides, petty judges and advocates were the only members of the Third Estate with wide experience of public life and the confidence to speak out which it bred. Such men expected their talents to be recognized and drawn upon in the new political order, resenting any suggestion of limiting their opportunities. Noble insistence on maintaining political privileges reminded them of the pride and arrogance of the aristocratic magistrates whom they had all encountered in their professional lives, qualified to sit in judgment not by ability and knowledge, but by birth and wealth. The annals of judicial life in the later 18th century were littered with quarrels and clashes between bench and bar, petty and sovereign courts, whose legacy of bitterness, hitherto accepted as one of the unavoidable tribulations of the calling, now surfaced. Further occasions for such antagonisms to work themselves out were provided by the elections of the spring. The system by which the deputies of 1789 were chosen was extremely complex. Regulations issued on 24 January prescribed that the basic constituencies should be the ancient bailliage and sénéchaussée jurisdictions, in order to ensure a rough parity of size and population. However, smaller or secondary bailliage and sénéchaussée were grouped. There were other exceptions too. 8 major towns, including Lyon, Rouen, and Paris itself, were accorded separate representation. A number of small districts not granted separate representation initially were also accorded it later after petitions of protest. The greatest exception of all was the treatment of certain pays d'état. The regulation of 24 January effectively ended agitation for reforming or reviving provincial estates by making clear that they would not, contrary to earlier expectations, be the means of electing the national deputies. Nevertheless, it was thought prudent to allow this right to the newly constituted estates of Dauphiné and those of the technically distinct Kingdom of Navarre. Brittany might have won it too, had it not been for the bitter quarrels that had marked the last attempts to convene the estates. After that, it was decided to elect the Breton 30 state deputies by bailliage, the nobility and clergy choosing theirs in special assemblies representing the whole province. With these exceptions, each of the 234 constituencies was to have an electoral assembly for each order. Every noble enjoying full transmissible nobility was entitled to participate in the noble assemblies, as was every beneficed clergyman in the clerical ones. Monasteries and chapters, however, were only allowed elected representatives, and the very numbers of the Third Estate made indirect representation the only possibility. Accordingly, every male taxpayer over 25 had the right to attend a primary assembly, which chose 2 delegates for every 100 households to sit in the assembly, electing the ultimate Third Estate deputies. Each constituency was to be represented in the Estates General by 2 clerical, 2 noble, and 4 Third Estate deputies. And choosing them was the main function of the electoral assemblies. But they were also required by tradition to draw up cahiers or grievance lists to guide the deputies in their deliberations. In the Third Estate, every village and every urban guild and corporation was entitled to send one in, and they were conflated at the local electoral assembly into a single cahier for the order. Inevitably, in this process, many of the concerns of the king's poorer subjects were edited out. In many districts, the ultimate text of cahier was transparently based on models carefully put together and circulated by patriotic activists. Nevertheless, the cahiers or cahiers produced a picture of the outlook and preoccupations of a whole nation unique in Europe before the 20th century. And the very fact of being asked to articulate their grievances and aspirations with the implicit promise of redress, concentrated the minds of everybody involved on the seriousness of what was at stake. Throughout 1788, popular involvement in public affairs had been unprecedented, but still confined to a few major cities. The drafting of the cahiers drew in people throughout the country. The elections of 1789 were the most democratic spectacle ever seen in the history of Europe, and nothing comparable occurred again until far into the next century. Nor did the government make any serious attempts to influence the outcome. It was rumored that ministers hoped to use the diplomatic embarrassments created by Mirabeau's scurrilous secret history of the court of Berlin, published in January, to prevent its notorious author from being elected. But if that was so, they failed. Necker, in any case, thought that government interference in the elections would do more harm than good, creating bad blood in an assembly that ought to be inspired by goodwill. And yet, the very rules he laid down affected the results in important ways. They ensured that the electoral assemblies of the First Estate were dominated by parish priests, rather than members of the ecclesiastical corporations who had hitherto monopolized the government of the church. They excluded from the Second Estate assemblies all new nobles whose status had not yet become fully hereditary, and swamped formerly dominant groups such as courtiers and sovereign court magistrates with petty nobles of long lineage, slender means, and little public experience. And the indirect system adopted for the Third Estate effectively eliminated peasants, artisans, and everybody without abundant leisure from the stage at which deputies were chosen, while allowing the possibility of electing members of the other two orders. The Estates General were summoned to meet at Versailles on 27 April, and the elections ordered to be completed by then. In the event the Estates did not convene until 5th of May, and the last elections were not over until far into July. These late elections, including those of Paris, which were only completed in May, were influenced by the course of events in the body to which they were electing. But most went forward in March and April, and their background was continual pamphleteering, prolonged cold weather, and a slowly rising level of popular discontent as the harvest shortfalls of the previous summer pushed bread prices inexorably upwards. And the attendant industrial crisis swelled the ranks of the unemployed. Incidents were reported from all over the country of market day riots, popular price fixing, and ransacking of barns, warehouses, monasteries, and country houses, where hoarding of grain and flour was suspected. In Provence, there was also widespread refusal to pay tithes or taxes. And at Marseille, men of property became so alarmed at the inability of the established authorities to maintain order that on 23rd March, electors of all three estates combined to take over the city's government and set up a patriotic guard of substantial citizens. It was an idea with an important future nationally, but at this stage many found the overthrow of legitimate authorities shocking. In any case, though stretched, the normal forces of law and order still seemed capable of preventing popular passions from boiling over completely. This was most graphically shown when, late in April, disorder reached Paris. The outbreak was precipitated by electoral excitement following the first meetings of the 60 districts, in which members of the capital's 30 state electoral assembly were to be chosen on 21st April. On the 23rd, as the assembly of the Sainte-Marguerite district was discussing its cahier, most of its more prominent members, the wallpaper manufacturer Réveillon, remarked that the price of bread ought to be brought down to levels that wage earners on 15 sous a day could afford. Réveillon was well known for his benevolence towards the unemployed. But in the highly charged atmosphere of the occasion, his words were interpreted as a call for wage reductions. Similar remarks by Henriot, a saltpeter manufacturer, in another electoral assembly had the same effect. Over the next few days, rumors of wage reduction swept the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, the capital's working East End, and on the 27th, Henriot's house was sacked by angry crowds. In response, troops posted in the district were reinforced. But the next day they were swamped by several thousand rioters who stormed Réveillon's house and factory and destroyed everything in them. In the evening, a strong detachment of the French guards was brought in and opened fire. After 2 hours of further tumult, the crowd dispersed, leaving 25 dead and almost as many more wounded. Rumor magnified the casualties to hundreds, and there was much dark talk of plots. This was the atmosphere that greeted the deputies now arriving at Versailles for the opening of the estates. The rioters were known to have cheered the names of the king, of Necker, and the Third Estate, but they had also shouted, "Down with the rich," as they sacked prominent citizens' property, and the full force of authority had been deployed too late to prevent them. The capital must have appeared to the deputies even more disturbed than their native provinces. Who then were these men, in whom the boundless hopes and expectations aroused by months of frenzied debate and discussion were invested? What sort of deputies had the elections produced? The First Estate deputation represented a clear defeat for the established church hierarchy. 3/4 of the 303 clerical deputies elected were ordinary parish priests. Only 46 were bishops, so that the nobles, canons, and regulars who had hitherto controlled all the levers of power in the church were exposed as lacking the confidence of their subordinates. The clerical cahiers reinforced this impression with demands for higher stipends, abolition of tithe impropriation, unrestricted access to diocesan administrative posts, canonries and bishoprics, and church government by elected synods. Third Estate propagandists had campaigned hard for such results and welcomed them as a sign that the clergy would be sympathetic in the estates to the patriotic cause. They paid less attention to issues on which the clergy were united. The need to retain and indeed increase the church's control over education, to maintain censorship against the impieties of so-called philosophy, and to limit the toleration enjoyed by Protestants. In return for the surrender of their fiscal privileges, the clergy expected that the new order would confirm and reinforce the authority of the Catholic Church within the nation. The clerical consensus on these matters far outweighed the order's internal disagreements about the position of parish priests. But such deeper solidarities escaped the notice of most observers in the excitement of the elections. Their true importance would only emerge at a later stage, as yet scarcely foreseen by anybody. In the case of the nobility, too, the elections brought rejection of groups hitherto taken for leaders of the order. Courtiers expected almost automatic election. Most of the young nobility, reported the Duke of Dorset on 19 February, are quitting this capital, ambitious of being deputed to the great National Assembly. But once in the long unvisited provinces where their estates lay, they frequently found themselves bitterly opposed by local squires, resentful of their lofty ways. Often they were returned with great difficulty. Although in the end they did better than the bishops in the clerical order, securing around a third of the representation. Among them were the Duke d'Orléans and several members of the Society of 30, such as Lafayette. On the other hand, the elections were a complete disaster for the robed nobility of the sovereign courts. Only 22 members of this proud, articulate, and self-confident oligarchy secured seats, although they included heroes of the 1788 struggles like Duport, Freteau, and Despremisnil. But few rough country squires were returned either, despite their showing at the electoral assemblies. The largest contingent among the 322 who sat as noble deputies was made up of town-dwelling scions of the old established provincial families, not poor, but whose only previous experience of public life, if they had any at all, had been in the army. Like the parish clergy, they recognized that they were being presented with a unique opportunity to vent the frustrations and resentments of generations, and many of the noble electoral assemblies were extremely stormy. Some split, returned rival lists of deputies, and drew up rival cahiers. The nobility of Brittany, outraged that their province's delegation was not to be returned by its estates, voted to boycott the elections, and no Breton nobles ever sat in the Estates General. Noble cahiers reflected their author's disarray. Only on agreement to give up all fiscal privileges was there near unanimity. A mere 8% of the cahiers, it is true, called for voting by head in the estates. But the number insisting on vote by order on all occasions barely exceeded 40%. The rest being prepared for one form or another of compromise. Nobility, almost 40%, thought should be the reward of services and talent rather than riches. But no other question rallied opinion on a comparable scale. After the estates met, the noble deputies would polarize into a liberal minority of around 90 who were prepared to seek ways of coming to terms with Third Estate aspirations, and an intransigent majority. The liberals tended to be younger, more metropolitan, better traveled, and better read. But they were drawn, like their opponents, from right across the social spectrum of the nobility. The second order in the state, therefore, came to the political test of 1789 in confusion. prepared and in many ways eager for change. They were nevertheless unnerved by the hostility towards them that had sprung up since the autumn and torn apart by internal resentments and snobberies far more complex than those affecting the clergy. They had none of the First Order's deeper unity to fall back on. For all its impressive combination of wealth, power, and place, the French nobility was far weaker, less well organized, and less self-confident than its Third Estate opponents imagined. These disadvantages were fully mirrored by the deputies sent to represent it at Versailles. The Third Estate deputies, by contrast, were remarkably homogeneous and united. No peasants or artisans got beyond the first electoral stage, when the minority who voted at all, in Paris even, only a quarter of the 50,000 or so electors chose to exercise their right, tended to be people of some education and leisure, and to prefer others like themselves. Those who went to the secondary assemblies, not to mention those finally returned for the Estates General, were expected to pay their own expenses. More important still, the elections were inevitably dominated by people experienced in public speaking, handling meetings, and drafting documents. This meant, above all, the lawyers and office holders who had been so conspicuous in all the public agitation since September of 1788. 2/3 of those elected had some form or other of legal qualifications. A quarter were advocates or notaries, among them people like Barnave and Robespierre. 45%, 294, were holders of venal offices, including many senior judges from Bailliage and Sénéchaussée courts, who had been entrusted by electoral regulations with the organization of the Third Estate assemblies. In contrast, there were only 99 deputies involved in trade or industry. Only 9 members of the other 2 orders benefited from Necker's decision to allow electors to choose outside their orders, although they included Sieyès from the clergy and Mirabeau from the nobility. But although the Third Estate contingent boasted these and other celebrities who had come to public notice during the struggles of the preceding 2 years, men like Mounier, the leader of the Dauphiné Patriots, target the pride of the Parisian bar, and eminent scientists like the astronomer Bailly, most of the deputies were unknown and untested outside their own localities. Apart from their similar social and educational background, what united them more than anything was their commitment to voting by head and civil and fiscal equality. Any doubts about this commitment did not survive the first 2 days of the estate's meetings. The opening session of the Estates General eventually took place on 5th of May amid great pomp and ceremonial. After a solemn service of dedication the afternoon before, the three orders processed to the largest hall in Versailles in the costume dictated by precedent. The clergy in their vestments, the nobility in silk, swords, cloth of gold waistcoats, and white plumed hats, and the third in sober black. Huge and expectant crowds watched the parade, and it would probably have been impossible for any of the opening speeches to match the hopes placed in them. But nobody had expected to be bored, which was what the speeches of the Keeper of the Seals and Necker achieved. The former was completely inaudible, and the latter's voice gave out half an hour into his 3-hour oration, which then had to be read out for him. Nor, despite repeated bursts of enthusiastic applause, were the issues on everybody's mind squarely addressed. While insisting that the estates had not been convoked for reasons of financial necessity, Necker nevertheless concentrated most of his remarks on fiscal and budgetary matters. He promised royal and ministerial support for a whole range of administrative and judicial reforms, although he hinted that in the last resort, the king would retain the power to reject measures he did not like. But on the question of voting, he continued to sit on the fence. While recommending common voting on the most momentous or urgent issues, he declared that on others, vote by order might be more appropriate. And in any case, the question must be settled not by authority, but by the free agreement of the clergy and nobility to give up vote by order. They could only do this by first convening separately to verify the election returns of their respective orders. Over the preceding week, the air had been full of far from groundless rumors that a party at court led by Artois and the Queen were pressing for Necker's dismissal. And shrewder members of his audience guessed that in drafting the speech, the minister had not enjoyed a free hand. But most, on all sides, were disappointed by his equivocations, and extremists left the hall determined to settle the question of verification clearly before any other business was transacted. The struggle began the next morning. Amid the confusion and hesitations of deputies still unfamiliar with each other and awed by the momentousness of what they were involved in. Men who knew clearly what they wanted made the running. In the Third Estate, representatives from Brittany and Dauphiné, whose provincial political experience over preceding months was far wider than that of others, argued that separate verification would inevitably lead to separate voting too. It must therefore be opposed. After a prolonged and chaotic debate, the Third, whose idea of themselves was reflected in their adoption of the tendentious title, the Commons, agreed not to verify any of their powers, or indeed transact any business at all, in isolation. The nobility, meanwhile, showed no hesitation. On 7th of May, they voted by 188 votes to 46 to proceed with separate verification. By the 11th, it was complete, and the order declared itself constituted. The clergy, too, voted to proceed with separate verification, but only after lengthy debate, and only by 133 votes to 114, nor when the process was complete did they go so far as to declare themselves constituted. Earnest and sincere ministers of the gospel, as most of them were, they hoped to find some harmonious compromise. And so, they welcomed a deputation sent by the Third on 7th of May asking for tripartite discussions about common verification, and called upon the nobility to do the same. A week later, the nobility agreed. But when the representatives of the three orders met, they found the Thirds mandated to accept nothing but vote by head. Responding in kind, the nobles argued that all the precedents were against common verification, and on 26 May, they withdrew from the talks. The Third, now reinforced by the arrival of deputies from Paris, thereupon renewed its appeals to the clergy, inviting them, in the name of the God of peace and the national interests, to join with them in the General Assembly Hall and there act in concert to bring about union and concord. As the clergy agonized over this further assault on their conscience, on the 29th, the king himself intervened to condemn the inaction of the estates. He urged resumption of conciliatory talks, and they were resumed but with no more positive result than before. Meanwhile, on 4th of June, the heir to the throne died, plunging the king into days of gloomy inertia, which paralyzed all ministerial activity. By the second week of the month, Third Estate patience was running out. Against their previous resolutions, they had already begun to organize themselves and establish procedures. And on 3rd June, they elected Bailey as their president. There was now constant talk of unilateral action, of declaring the Commons to be the National Assembly, and of proceeding to verification of powers on that basis without further reference to the other two orders. On 10th June, this talk at last culminated in a formal motion moved by CS that a final appeal should be sent to the other two orders to join at once in common verification. Failing that, the Commons would proceed anyway. The motion was carried by 493 votes to 41. The message was transmitted the next day, and when, on the 12th, no response was received from the other two orders, the roll call began. With it began the true revolutionary struggle. If the king had authorized vote by head the previous December, or if the nobility and clergy had agreed to common verification when the estates had first met, all would have been in order, and the chain of the law remained unbroken. The time they waited before cutting the cable, in CS phrase, shows how reluctant the law-soaked deputies of the Third were to flout legality. For to declare themselves the only legitimate body of national representatives, without reference to the other two orders, was in effect to take the law into their own hands. They recognized, too, that there was no going back. The decision was taken in public. For, unlike the other two orders, the Third had admitted spectators from the very beginning. And as the stalemate continued, the numbers flocking daily from Paris to Versailles steadily increased. There was no support among these onlookers for the nobility or the clergy, whereas every intransigent speech in the Commons was greeted with wild applause. Pleas for caution and restraint from the minority who still clung to dwindling hopes of agreement were drowned with cheers and catcalls. Nor is there much doubt that the unruly crowds at Versailles represented a much wider public opinion, aroused by months of frenzied publicity, and now by daily newspaper accounts of what the Estates General were doing, or rather not doing. Leading this field were Mirabeau's letters to his constituents, in which one of the most prominent deputies produce regular and accurate, though scarcely unbiased, reports of everything that happened in the Great Assembly. Nobody had trusted Mirabeau when the Estates began, but he soon demonstrated hitherto untried oratorical powers and an unerring talent for expressing precisely what his fellow deputies were merely groping towards. Soon, he was marshaling the thousands of subscribers to his journal behind the patriotic cause, especially in Paris, where the long drawn-out elections also sustained the political temperature. And although the focus of political attention was obviously at Versailles, the forcing house of political opinion was in the fashionable West End of the capital, in the arcades, cafes, and walks of the Palais Royal, thrown open to the public as a pleasure garden in 1780 by its owner, the Duc d'Orléans. By 1789, it had become a center for rumor, debate, and pamphleteering. I went to the Palais Royal, wrote Arthur Young on 9th of June, to see what new things were published and to procure a catalogue of all. Every hour produces something new. 13 came out today, 16 yesterday, and 92 last week. One can scarcely squeeze from the door to the counter. 19/20 of these productions are in favor of liberty and commonly violent against the clergy and nobility. But the coffee houses in the Palais Royal present yet more singular and astonishing spectacles. They are not only crowded within, but other expectant crowds are at the doors and windows, listening à gorge déployée to certain orators who from chairs and tables harangue each his little audience. The eagerness with which they are heard and the thunder of applause they receive for every sentiment of more than common heartiness or violence against the present government cannot easily be imagined.